Chapter 1. Introduction. Why Elizabeth II is a figure of the century. Imagine a time when almost everything we take for granted today seemed unimaginable. No internet, no color television, no air travel for the general population. It was the year 1926, in the middle of the Roaring Twenties, when a little princess was born in a London townhouse, whose life was to be inextricably linked to the most dramatic upheavals of the 20th and early 21st centuries. This princess was Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor, who later became Queen Elizabeth II. At the time, no one suspected that she would one day become the longest reigning monarch in British history. And yet she became a figure who not only shaped British history, but became a global symbol of consistency and continuity in a world that was constantly changing. The fascination of her person lies not only in the length of her reign, which lasted from 1952 to 2022, i.e., over 70 years. Rather, it is the ability to represent a kind of calm pole in the midst of radical social, political, and technological upheavals. When Elizabeth ascended the throne, Winston Churchill was Prime Minister, and the British Empire still included large parts of Africa and Asia. When she died in 2022, Britain had long been part of a globalized world. The colonies had disappeared, and the Prime Minister she most recently appointed, Liz Truss, belonged to a very different political generation. This span is what makes it special. Elizabeth II was the link between an old imperial order and a modern pluralistic society. But why is she considered a figure of the century, far beyond the borders of Great Britain? There are several reasons for this. On the one hand, it embodied continuity in a time when nothing was as certain as change. In a world that experienced wars, economic crises, the collapse of the empire, European integration, the Cold War, terrorism, and digital revolutions, the Queen was a face that remained. For decades, her portrait hung in the living rooms of the British, her profile could be seen on coins and stamps, and in countless ceremonies she performed the same rituals that her predecessors had practiced for centuries. But this continuity was not rigid or backward-looking. Elizabeth knew how to adapt the ancient institution of the monarchy to the present without betraying its core. Her coronation in 1953 was the first major event to be broadcast live on television, a revolutionary step at the time that brought the monarchy into the living rooms of millions of people. Decades later, she let cameras look into the private lives of the royals for the first time to create transparency and reduce the distance between the crown and the people. She was thus not only a symbol, but also the manager of a system that had to prove its legitimacy again and again. On the other hand, Elizabeth II was a figure who attracted worldwide attention. No other monarch undertook so many trips abroad, spoke to so many heads of state, met so many cultures. She traveled abroad over 250 times, visited more than 100 countries, and met politicians from Charles de Gaulle to Nelson Mandela, from John F. Kennedy to Barack Obama, from Mikhail Gorbachev to Xi Jinping. Hardly any other person in history has known so many influential personalities from such different political systems. And yet she always remained nonpartisan, neutral, reserved, a contrast to the often shrill world politics around her. Elizabeth II was also a symbol of the Commonwealth, the loose confederation of former colonies and dominions that emerged after World War II to replace the crumbling empire. While many countries gained their political independence, the Queen remained a common figure for them, conveying a sense of connection and tradition. For Canada, Australia, or New Zealand, she was head of state. For many other countries, a respected moral authority. Without her personality, the Commonwealth would hardly have existed in this form. However, her importance was not only fed by her role, but also by her character. Elizabeth II knew how to maintain an aura of dignity and restraint. At a time when politicians and celebrities were increasingly in the headlines and made private matters public, she held on to one principle: the crown is bigger than the person. She hardly gave interviews, rarely commented directly on political issues, and that was precisely why she gained respect. One could say that by revealing almost nothing about its own views, It became a projection screen for an entire nation that saw in it the values it wanted for itself: a sense of duty, stability, calm. Of course, her reign was not free of crises. Scandals in the royal family, especially the failed marriage of Charles and Diana, shook confidence in the monarchy. Criticism of the costs of the royal family or its supposed backwardness was also loud again and again. But Elizabeth managed to lead the institution over this turbulence. Especially in moments of greatest crises, such as after the death of Princess Diana in 1997 or during the corona pandemic in 2020, she found words and gestures that comforted millions of people. Overall, Elizabeth II was much more than a queen. It was a living symbol of history, a mirror of her era, a fixed point in a time that often seemed to come apart at the seams. Her lifespan spanned almost a century, her reign more than 7 decades, and yet her legacy remains unquantifiable. It consists in the unique combination of tradition and modernity, in the art of making the crown appear stable over the storms of time, and in the ability to give millions of people around the world a feeling of closeness without ever giving up their distance. That is why Elizabeth II is a figure of the century, not because she made spectacular political decisions or because she actively steered world events, but because she embodied an institution that remained credible in her person. While presidents came and went, while ideologies rose and fell, while technologies changed entire worlds, she remained calm, disciplined, reliable. In this permanence lies the real greatness that made her an icon. Chapter 2: Childhood and Adolescence in the British Royal Family. Looking back on Elizabeth II's long lifespan today, it seems almost natural that she became queen. But in her childhood, nothing about it was taken for granted. When she was born on April 21, 1926, in an inconspicuous townhouse on Bruton Street in London, she was not destined for the throne. Her father, the future King George VI, was still Duke of York at the time, a shy man who stood in the shadow of his older brother, the then heir to the throne, Edward. No one expected that little Elizabeth would one day become the most important monarch of her era. Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor, her full name, was the first child of Albert, Duke of York, and his wife Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, who would later become one of the most popular figures in the royal family as Queen Mum. From birth, she grew up in a mixture of normality and courtly ritual. Her childhood was privileged, but surprisingly middle class compared to other royal children of the time. The family lived in London, but also in the tranquil Royal Lodge in Windsor, and Elizabeth's early years were characterized by closeness, warmth, and an almost idyllic family atmosphere. It became apparent early on that Elizabeth was a serious, dutiful child. Contemporary witnesses described her as calm, thoughtful, and surprisingly concentrated for her age. While other children were playful and wild, she loved to think in orderly ways, to observe rules, and to take responsibility. Her governess, Marion Crawford, affectionately known as Crawfie, later reported that Elizabeth had great respect for traditions, even as a little girl. She was orderly, enjoyed doing things carefully, and showed a remarkable interest in animals, especially horses and dogs, a passion that would accompany her whole life. Elizabeth did not grow up alone. In 1930, her sister Margaret Rose was born, the happier, livelier, sometimes moody little sister. While Elizabeth always took on the role of those responsible, Margaret was the whirlwind who caused hilarity and disorder. This interplay shaped the family: Elizabeth as the quiet, serious firstborn, Margaret as the playful counterpart. Despite these differences, the two sisters shared an intimate relationship that lasted until Margaret's death in 2002. Her training was initially private. Elizabeth never attended school in the conventional sense, which was not unusual in the royal family. Instead, governesses, private tutors, and selected private lecturers taught the princess subjects such as history, literature, French, and religion. Constitutional history and civics in particular played an important role. Elizabeth should understand early on the responsibility of a member of the royal family. Their parents attached great importance to the fact that the children acquired not only courtly knowledge, but also values such as discipline, a sense of duty, and empathy. Despite the formal upbringing, there was also room for normality in Elizabeth's childhood. She played in the garden, loved walking the dogs, and spent hours riding. She was already in the saddle at the age of 4, and soon she was considered an excellent rider. This passion for horses and equestrian sports was more than a hobby. It was a part of her identity, an anchor that helped her find inner peace in later times of crisis. The early 1930s were marked by a sense of security for Elizabeth's family. Although the United Kingdom, like the rest of the world, was affected by the consequences of the Great Depression, life in the royal environment was largely spared. The Duchess of York, Elizabeth's mother, tried to give her daughters as normal a childhood as possible. She wanted them to grow up not only as princesses, but also as girls who experienced love, trust, and family warmth. However, this idyll was to end abruptly in 1936, a year that went down as one of the most dramatic in the history of the British monarchy. The death of King George V, Elizabeth's grandfather, brought her uncle to the throne. As Edward VIII, however, he fell in love with the divorced American Wallis Simpson and decided to give up the crown for this love. All of a sudden, little Elizabeth's fate changed fundamentally. Her father, who as the second son had never wanted to be king, had to take over the crown and became George VI. Elizabeth, then 10 years old, thus became the direct heir to the throne. That moment was a turning point. From then on, it was clear to everyone, Elizabeth would become queen one day. For the girl herself, it meant that her childhood ended in a way. Although she remained a child who played and learned, the shadow of the crown now lay over her life. Her father, who himself suffered under the burden of the office, he was shy by nature and stuttered, became a role model for her. Elizabeth admired his fulfillment of duty and his bravery. It was this attitude that she would later embody in her role, the willingness to put aside personal inclinations in order to serve the crown and the country. The years following Edward VIII's abdication were a time of intense preparation for Elizabeth. Teachers of constitutional studies, history, and international relations taught them specifically to prepare them for their future role. She learned how Parliament functioned, what role the monarchy plays in a constitutional democracy, and what duties a head of state has to fulfill. At the same time, she developed a strong sense of responsibility towards her people, although she had hardly any direct contact with the public during this phase. But the 1930s were not only marked by upheavals within the family. Europe was moving towards World War II, and Elizabeth's youth was soon marked by this threat. When the war broke out in 1939, she was 13 years old, an age at which other girls cultivate their first school friendships or immerse themselves in the world of youth. For Elizabeth, the war meant a confrontation with responsibility and duty on a scale she had never known before. She remained in Windsor, together with her sister Margaret, while German bombs fell on London. Soon, she went public with her first radio speeches to encourage children who, like her, were affected by the horrors of war. But before the war completely changed her life, Elizabeth had experienced a childhood that, despite all the peculiarities of the royal environment, was marked by love, care, and a certain normality. She learned early on that privilege and duty are inextricably linked, and she developed qualities that would later help her carry the heaviest inheritance a person can have in Britain, the crown. So her childhood was the foundation for everything that followed. The quiet, orderly girl became a young woman who knew that her life would not belong to herself, but to an institution and a people. And it was precisely in this awareness that she grew into her role, a role that she later filled with a discipline and dedication that would earn her worldwide recognition.
Chapter 3. The Changing World. Britain in the 1920s and 30s. When Elizabeth was born in the 1920s, Britain was at a historic turning point. The First World War was just 8 years ago, and the country was still bearing the brunt of its consequences. Millions of soldiers had fallen, countless families had lost loved ones, and society had to reorient itself. The splendor of the Victorian Empire, which had been considered the undisputed world power at the turn of the century, had faded. Britain continued to be a global player with a huge colonial empire, but economic and social realities began to change. It was precisely during this time of upheaval that little Elizabeth grew up, in a country that was looking for its old identity and at the same time dared to take the leap into a modern era. The 1920s were initially characterized by a mixture of optimism and exhaustion. Many Britons longed for stability and normality after the horrors of war. Technical progress provided new possibilities. The radio found its way into households, the first automobiles dominated the streets, and cinema began to captivate people. At the same time, there was a wave of cultural renewal. Writers such as Virginia Woolf or James Joyce broke with old narrative forms, and young jazz music found its way to Europe. In Great Britain, too, the energy of the Roaring Twenties was felt. But this splendor did not reach all sections of the population. Lurking behind the surface was economic uncertainty, which was soon to become a harsh reality in the 1930s. The monarchy itself played a contradictory role in these years. King George V, Elizabeth's grandfather, was a conservative, rather reserved monarch who deliberately staged the royal family as a symbol of stability. At a time when many European monarchies had collapsed after the war, for example in Germany, Russia, or Austria-Hungary, George V wanted to present the British crown as a firm anchor. For people, the royal family was a visible sign of continuity, a familiar image in a world that was constantly changing. Elizabeth grew up into a family that not only maintained private ties, but also carried the burden of representing an entire nation. But while the royal family radiated stability, the lives of many Britons were marked by uncertainty. Economic reconstruction after the First World War was sluggish. Unemployment was high, especially in the north of England and in the industrial regions of Wales and Scotland. Miners, steelworkers, and shipyard workers suffered from wage cuts and job losses. The general strike of 1926, the very year Elizabeth was born, was a dramatic signal. Millions of workers paralyzed the country to demand better working conditions and higher wages. It didn't mean anything to the little princess at the time, but it was a formative moment for the country, a sign that the social order was no longer as stable as it had been in the Victorian era. The 1930s finally brought disillusionment. The Great Depression, which began in the USA in 1929, also hit Great Britain hard. Factories closed, banks got into trouble, and unemployment rose to dramatic levels. Entire regions that depended on coal mining or heavy industry sank into poverty. It was a time when many families didn't know how to get through the next day. While Elizabeth and her sister grew up sheltered in Windsor, countless children experienced lack, hunger, and lack of prospects in the same years. This social divide had a lasting impact on British society. At the same time, a new awareness was forming during this time. Great Britain could no longer rely on its empire alone. While the colonial empire still encompassed vast swaths of the world, India, much of Africa, Canada, Australia, and many smaller territories, the first signs of disintegration were palpable. In India, Mahatma Gandhi demanded independence ever more vehemently with his nonviolent protests. In Ireland, the conflict was unresolved after the partition of the island, and resistance was also brewing in other colonies. The empire was formally at its peak, but internally it began to crumble. For little Elizabeth, who received her first political lessons during this time, this meant that her future role would no longer be that of an empress over a vast empire, but that of a monarch who had to learn to combine tradition with change. Political tensions at home also increased. In the 1930s, Britain saw fascist movements gain influence, inspired by the rise of Mussolini in Italy and Hitler in Germany. Oswald Mosley and his British Union of Fascists marched through London in black uniforms, which filled many Britons with concern. At the same time, the Labour Party gained influence and demanded social reforms. The political climate was heated and democracy was under pressure. For Elizabeth, who as a young princess was kept away from these debates, this time nevertheless meant an indirect imprint. She grew up in a country that felt torn between tradition and modernization, between stability and radical movements. In addition, there was the foreign policy threat. While Elizabeth lived through her carefree childhood years, Europe was inexorably preparing for a new war. In Germany, Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, and his aggressive plans for expansion soon threatened the fragile balance on the continent. In Italy, Mussolini dreamed of a new Roman Empire, and in Spain, a civil war raged from 1936 onwards, in which fascists and republicans fought bitterly against each other. Britain tried to avert the danger with a policy of appeasement, but the threat became more and more real.
For the royal family, and thus also for the young Elizabeth, this meant that the ideal world of Windsor was overshadowed by an approaching conflict that would profoundly change her life and her role. It is interesting how much Elizabeth's life in these years differed from that of many other children, and at the same time was not completely detached. She had tutors instead of classmates, lived in castles and mansions, traveled in royal cars. And yet she noticed that outside in the streets of the cities, there was unemployment, poverty, and political tensions. Her parents, George VI and Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, tried not to completely shield their children from these realities. They should be protected, but they should also develop a sense that their privileged life went hand in hand with responsibility. The 1920s and 30s were an epoch full of contrasts for Great Britain. Cultural awakening and economic hardship, colonial greatness and the first signs of disintegration, political stability and looming threats. For Elizabeth, it was the years of childhood and adolescence in which she laid the foundations for her later life. She grew up in a world that moved between the past and the future, and it was precisely in this field of tension that she developed the qualities that would later distinguish her: a sense of duty, seriousness, and the ability to accept change without losing sight of her role. If you look at the photos from that time, you can see a little girl with alert eyes, often accompanied by her sister, sometimes riding, sometimes playing in the garden. Behind this seemingly idyllic picture, there was already a premonition of a great responsibility. Because the country in which she grew up was no longer the self-confident, undisputed Great Britain of the 19th century. It was a country in upheaval that was soon to plunge into the abyss of a world war again. And in the middle of it all, a princess grew up who one day would become the face of an entire nation.
Chapter 4. Elizabeth in World War II. When the sirens wailed in London in September 1939 and Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain announced the declaration of war on Germany over the radio, Elizabeth was 13 years old. In other families, this would have meant that a carefree childhood ended abruptly. This was especially true for the little princess. In one fell swoop, she found herself in a country that was about to plunge into the toughest conflict in its modern history. Her role was not a military one, she did not take up arms, but she learned early on that a member of the royal family also had to be part of the national effort. Elizabeth spent the first years of the war with her sister Margaret in Windsor Castle, about 30 kilometers west of London. The decision had been made deliberately. The city was highly endangered by German air raids, and the risk of leaving the two princesses in the capital seemed too great. Some had even suggested evacuating the girls to Canada. But Queen Elizabeth, who later became the Queen Mum, categorically rejected this. "The children don't go without me, I don't go without the king, and the king never leaves England," she is said to have said. This attitude was not only an expression of steadfastness, but also a strong signal to the nation. The royal family remained by the side of its people, even in the darkest hour. For Elizabeth and Margaret, Windsor meant a mixture of shelter and prison. The large castle complex offered security, but the constant threat of war hovered over everything. Elizabeth received private lessons, continued to learn history, politics, and languages, but everyday life was marked by darkening, restrictions, and a feeling of insecurity. Nevertheless, it was precisely during this time that she developed that seriousness that later became so characteristic of her. A pivotal moment came in 1940 when Elizabeth first spoke publicly to the nation. Via BBC Radio, she and her sister addressed the children who had been evacuated from London to comfort and encourage them. In clear, calm words, she explained that she herself also had to live apart from friends and familiar places, and she assured that everything will be fine. For many people, it was moving to hear the voice of the young princess, a sign that the royal family shared the concerns and fears of the population. For Elizabeth herself, it was the first step into a role that would accompany her throughout her life, the voice of encouragement in times of crisis. While the Battle of Britain raged and German bombers dropped their charges over London night after night, Elizabeth experienced the war from a relative distance, but never completely shielded. She saw devastation during visits to the city, heard reports of destroyed houses, and knew about the plight of many people.
Her father, King George VI, and mother were famous for their determination to stay in the middle of the capital, even though Buckingham Palace itself was hit by bombs several times. This attitude also shaped Elizabeth. In these years, the monarchy was not to be a symbol of luxury, but a symbol of steadfastness. As Elizabeth grew older, she wanted to take a more active part in the war herself. She wasn't content to just be an observer or give occasional radio talks. In 1945, at the age of 18, she joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the ATS, an auxiliary unit of the British Army for women. There, she trained as a driver and mechanic, an unusual job for a princess. Elizabeth learned to drive trucks, repair engines, and maintain vehicles. Photos show her in uniform, with oil-smeared hands, working intently on an engine. These pictures went around the world and made it clear the future queen was also willing to make her contribution. This step was more than just symbolic. For Elizabeth, it was a moment of emancipation. For the first time, she left the narrow paths of courtly education to a certain extent and entered a community of women who came from all walks of life. She experienced camaraderie, discipline, and the feeling of being a small cog in a huge war machine. It was a formative period that gave her not only practical skills, but also a deeper understanding of the lives of her subjects. The war ended in 1945 with the victory of the Allies, but the relief in Britain was mixed with deep exhaustion. Millions of families had suffered losses, the cities were bombed, the economy was on the ground. When Germany's surrender was announced on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, hundreds of thousands of people poured into the streets of London. Among them were Elizabeth and Margaret, not in a magnificent setting, but secretly, unrecognized, among the masses. Later, Elizabeth said that she and her sister roamed the crowd, cheering and singing arm in arm with strangers. For a brief moment, the princess was not a symbol, but simply part of the people who dissolved into joy after years of deprivation. This evening became a memory for her that she never forgot. It showed her how deep the bond between monarchy and people could be when the barriers fell, and both sides felt that they stood together. It was a lesson that she often remembered later as queen. The crown does not live from distance, but from closeness, and sometimes you have to stand in the middle of the crowd to feel this bond. For Elizabeth, the Second World War was not only a historical epoch that she experienced as a young woman. He was the toughstone on which her personality was formed. The sheltered girl became a young woman who took duty seriously, took responsibility, and experienced the hardships of life, at least to some extent. The war brought her closer to a world that went far beyond the gardens of Windsor, the world of mechanics, soldiers, mothers who had to bring their children to safety, families who had lost everything. If you look at her later years, it becomes clear how much this period shaped her. The calmness, the discipline, the seriousness, much of this was already present in her childhood, but the war gave these qualities a new depth. Elizabeth understood that her role was not personal glory, but service. The motto, "I serve," which she later chose as the motto of her reign, had its roots in this time. When peace returned, Elizabeth was 19 years old, a young woman who had already accompanied a nation through dark years. She was not an ordinary girl of her generation, but in some ways she shared their experiences: the blackouts, the fear of bombs, the restrictions of rationing. All this made her more approachable, more human, and strengthened the connection to her people. The Second World War was the decisive background for Elizabeth's path to becoming queen. He made the princess a symbol of hope, he made her take responsibility, and gave her the opportunity to prove herself in a role that went far beyond that of a royal child. In a world that lay in ruins, the young woman began her path that would soon lead her to the center of British history.
Chapter 5. Heir to the Throne Against Expectations. Edward VIII's Abdication and Her Father's Rise. There are moments in history that seem to be small personal decisions, but in reality change the course of entire nations. One such moment occurred in 1936, when Elizabeth was just 10 years old. Until then, her life had been sheltered, full of routines and childish discoveries. She was a princess, but no one thought it likely that she would ever become queen. Her uncle, Edward VIII, was the heir to the throne, and he was young enough that it was assumed that he would rule for many decades. But his personal life turned everything upside down,
and suddenly Elizabeth was in a place that would determine her entire existence. Edward VIII was a charismatic, modern man. Many people in Great Britain loved him for his open manner, his elegance, and the ability to make direct contact with the population. But at the same time, he was also headstrong and put personal wishes above the strict duties of the crown. When he became king in 1936, he was already in a relationship with the American Wallis Simpson, a woman who was not only divorced, but was still living in a second marriage at the time. For the British establishment, church, politics, and court, this was unthinkable. The king was both secular and spiritual leader, and a marriage to a divorced woman who had two ex-husbands contradicted all the norms of the time. Edward VIII was faced with a choice: crown or love, and he chose love. On December 11, 1936, in a world-famous radio address, he declared that he was abdicating because he did not consider it possible to fulfill his duty as king without the support of the woman he loved. It was an unparalleled scandal, a political earthquake. Never before had a British monarch resigned the throne of his own free will. It was a shock for the population, a crisis for the government, and a turning point for the royal family. Edward's abdication brought Elizabeth's father, the Duke of York, to the throne. The reserved, stuttering Albert became King George VI, a man who had never considered himself suitable and yet took on the burden because there was no alternative. Suddenly, Elizabeth was also in a completely new position. The little princess, who could have led a life of relative seclusion, became the direct heir to the throne. This transition was a decisive moment for Elizabeth. She was still a child, but old enough to understand the implications. She felt that the expectations of her were changing, that she was no longer just the daughter of the Duke of York, but the potential queen of Britain and the Empire. It was a quiet but profound incision in her childhood. For King George VI, his coronation in 1937 marked the beginning of a difficult journey. He was insecure in his public appearance, suffered from a severe stutter, and often did not feel up to the task. But it was precisely this struggle that made him a symbol of steadfastness. Together with his wife, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, he faced the challenges of the time. During the Second World War, he remained in London, sharing the fate of his people and thus gaining respect and affection. For little Elizabeth, her father was a role model. She saw him fulfill his duty in spite of personal difficulties, a lesson that she herself later shaped in her reign. The new role as heir to the throne brought with it a different form of education for Elizabeth. While her sister Margaret continued to enjoy a comparatively carefree childhood, Elizabeth was specifically prepared for her future tasks. Her teachers deepened the lessons in constitutional studies, history, and diplomacy. She began to attend meetings with politicians, accompanied her parents on official occasions, and became acquainted with the mechanisms of the court. Step by step, she grew into a role that she had not chosen herself, but which had become inevitable. It was remarkable how seriously she took this task. Contemporary witnesses reported that Elizabeth developed an attitude as a young girl that was reminiscent of adult responsibility. She didn't play queen, she prepared herself inwardly to be one day. She accepted the fate that had been imposed on her by Edward's abdication without ever questioning it. Perhaps this was one reason why her later reign was so stable. She had learned from childhood that personal wishes had to take a back seat to duty. However, the abdication crisis not only had personal consequences for Elizabeth, but also changed the image of the monarchy in society. For the first time, the people saw that a king was also human, that he could fail and abdicate. The ideal of the unshakable monarch who stood above everything was broken. It was all the more important that George VI and later Elizabeth II once again surrounded the crown with an aura of permanence. Elizabeth understood early on. Her job would be not only to represent a nation, but also to regain trust that had been lost by the abdication. Elizabeth's relationship with her uncle Edward always remained ambivalent. Although he was the man who had shaped her fate through his decision, he was a marginal figure in the royal family from then on. Edward lived in exile with Wallis Simpson, mainly in France, and rarely returned to Britain. For the young princess, it was more of a shadow, a reminder that personal wishes and duties could clash irreconcilably in the monarchy. Thus, the abdication crisis of 1936 was far more than a romantic story about love and duty. She was the starting point for Elizabeth's path to becoming queen. Without Edward VIII and his decision, she might have led a different life, one in relative anonymity, perhaps as a member of the extended royal family, but not as a symbol of an entire nation. Instead, she became the bearer of hope, the future queen whose path was mapped out from that moment on. For Elizabeth, this meant an early confrontation with the harsh reality of the crown. It is not a fairy tale, but a burden. But it was a burden that she carried, quietly, resolutely, and without hesitation. The day her father took over the crown was also the day she herself began to understand that her life no longer belonged to her, but to an institution that would last for centuries.
Chapter 6. The Wedding with Philip Mountbatten. By the time Elizabeth grew into a young woman in the late 1940s, she had not only learned to accept her role as heir to the throne, but had also lost her heart. Their love was for a man who, in many respects, did not correspond to the image that the conservative circles of the court dreamed of a future prince consort. But it was precisely this love that developed into one of the most sustainable and well-known marriages of the 20th century, the marriage between Princess Elizabeth and Philip Mountbatten. The history of this fraternity began as early as the 1930s. Elizabeth was just 13 years old when she first consciously met Philip. He was 5 years older, a Royal Navy cadet, and was introduced to the young princess during a visit to the naval school at Dartmouth. For Elizabeth, it was love at first sight. She had a crush on the young officer with the blue eyes, the self-confident demeanor, and the charming manner. For Philip, on the other hand, it was initially more of an encounter, like many others. He was a young man who lived his life, full of a thirst for adventure and freedom. But in the years that followed, a deep affection developed between the two. Philip Mountbatten was not a typical candidate for the British royal family from birth. He came from the Greek and Danish royal families, but was uprooted in his childhood. His family lived in exile. He grew up partly in France, partly in Germany, and finally in Great Britain. His mother suffered from mental illness. His father lived away from the family. Philip spent much of his youth alone in boarding schools, which shaped him into an independent, headstrong character. It was precisely these traits, self-confidence, humor, directness, that made him so attractive to Elizabeth. During World War II, Philip served as a naval officer on active duty. He took part in naval battles, was stationed in the Mediterranean, the Pacific, and other theaters of war. For Elizabeth, who spent the war in Windsor and later served in the auxiliary units herself, Philip was a hero, a man who did not shy away from the harshness of life and proved himself in practice. Her letters to him testify to a growing closeness that became more and more intimate despite distance and danger. After the end of the war, it was clear to Elizabeth that she wanted to share her life with Philip. But this decision was not immediately met with enthusiasm at court. Some thought he was too poor, European. He had German relatives, including sisters who were married to officers of the Nazi regime. Others thought he was too impetuous, not sensitive enough for the role at Elizabeth's side. Even King George VI was initially skeptical whether Philip was the right man for his daughter. But Elizabeth left no doubt. She loved him and wanted to marry him. Philip, on the other hand, had to make concessions to make this marriage possible. He renounced his Greek and Danish titles, took British citizenship, and anglicized his name. Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark became Philip Mountbatten, named after the family of his maternal relatives, the Battenbergs, who had renamed themselves Mountbatten during World War I. He also had to sacrifice his career in the Navy because an independent professional life was hardly conceivable at the side of the future queen. On November 20, 1947, the wedding of Princess Elizabeth and Philip Mountbatten took place in Westminster Abbey. It was a celebration that not only moved the British people, but was also a symbol of hope and new beginnings. The country was still in ruins from the Second World War, food was rationed, many cities were destroyed. And yet hundreds of thousands of people poured onto the streets to catch a glimpse of the bride and groom. Millions watched the ceremony on the radio. For many, this wedding was a ray of hope, a sign that life went on, that love and the future were stronger than the shadows of war. Elizabeth wore an ivory satin dress embroidered with pearls and crystals designed by Norman Hartnell. In times of rationing, even the future queen had to use her dress coupons to pay for the fabric, a detail that showed many Britons that she also shared the deprivations.
The wedding was magnificent but not exaggerated, a balancing act between royal tradition and the modest circumstances of the post-war period. The marriage between Elizabeth and Philip began in a mixture of romance and a sense of duty. Elizabeth loved her husband with a depth that remained palpable throughout the years of her reign. Philip, on the other hand, knew how to stir up the sometimes cumbersome world of the royal family with humor, directness, and energy. He was the one who made Elizabeth laugh, who grounded her, and helped her carry the burden of the crown. But he was also a man who had his own ambitions and did not always easily fit into the role of the prince consort. The first years of their marriage were comparatively normal, as far as that was possible for a princess and her husband. The couple lived for a time in Malta, where Philip was stationed in the Royal Navy. For Elizabeth, these years were a time of happiness. She was able to lead the life of a wife to a certain extent, far away from constant observation, and enjoyed the relative freedom on the Mediterranean island. She took care of the household, went shopping, lived almost like a middle-class woman, as normal as she could. But this happiness did not last. Soon the reality of the crown caught up with them. Her father, George VI, was in poor health, and his role as king weighed heavily on him. Elizabeth increasingly had to take on tasks, travel, accompany state affairs. This also ended the idea of an independent life for Philip. He became more and more involved in courtly duties, a role he did not always accept easily. Nevertheless, Elizabeth and Philip's wedding was the beginning of a partnership that would last more than 7 decades. Their love defied resistance, political reservations, and personal tensions. They complemented each other in their differences. Elizabeth, the quiet, disciplined, tradition-conscious woman; Philip, the direct, sometimes brusque, but always loyal partner. Together, they formed a pair that became a symbol for many Britons and people around the world, a symbol of preeminence in a world that was constantly changing. Thus, November 20, 1947, marked not only a private moment of happiness, but also a new public beginning. For Elizabeth, it was the day she became not only heir to the throne, but also wife, a dual role that was to shape her life. For Philip, it was the step into a new existence, which often demanded sacrifices from him, but at the same time gave him a central role in the history of the 20th century. And for the British people, it was a celebration that gave hope. Flags flew in the streets of London, people cheered, and for one day it seemed as if the worries of the post-war period were behind them. It was the beginning of a marriage that not only connected two people, but also accompanied an entire country with its symbolic power. Chapter 7. The First Years as a Princess, Travels and Obligations. After her marriage to Philip Mountbatten, Elizabeth began a period of transition. She was now a wife, soon also a mother, but at the same time the direct heir to the throne. It was a time in which she gradually grew into the role that would soon fall to her in full. Her first years as a princess were marked by travel, official commitments, and ever-increasing responsibilities, and they already showed how Elizabeth began to master the balance between private life and public role. At first, Elizabeth was allowed to experience something that she was rarely granted later, a certain normality. The first years of their marriage to Philip were spent partly in Malta, where Philip served as an officer in the Royal Navy. They lived there in a rented villa, far away from the rigid protocol of the British court. For Elizabeth, this time was a precious gift. She could go shopping, receive friends, attend parties, and she could live a life similar to that of young wives around the world. She enjoyed being not only a princess for a short time, but first and foremost a wife and young woman. But this phase did not last long. As early as the end of the 1940s, it became clear to her that she would have to gradually give up her personal freedom. The health of her father, King George VI, deteriorated noticeably. He suffered from a severe lung disease that was exacerbated by decades of smoking. Elizabeth increasingly had to represent him at public appointments. This moved it more into the center of the country's political and social life. Her first official trips as a princess took her across Great Britain. She visited factories, hospitals, schools, and cities that had been destroyed by the war. Everywhere she met people who hoped that the monarchy would give them support. Elizabeth showed the qualities that would later become her trademark: seriousness, empathy, and the ability to listen. She didn't speak much, but she radiated a presence that conveyed confidence. Soon, her sphere of activity also expanded abroad. Together with Philip, she undertook extensive trips to the Commonwealth countries, which took on a new meaning after the Second World War. The empire was about to change. More and more colonies were striving for independence, and the monarchy had to find a new role. Elizabeth became a kind of ambassador of this new era. She was young, modern, and seemed less distant than her predecessors. Many people in Canada, Australia, South Africa, and New Zealand saw her not only as the king's daughter, but as the embodiment of a new generation ready to build bridges between tradition and modernity. Her trip to South Africa in 1947, on the occasion of her 21st birthday, was particularly impressive. There, Elizabeth gave a speech that was to be considered programmatic for her entire reign. In no uncertain terms, she promised to dedicate her entire life, long or short, to serving the people and the Commonwealth. This statement, which was broadcast live on the radio, was more than a promise from a young woman. It was a solemn vow that she actually fulfilled until her death in 2022. Many historians see this speech as the moment when Elizabeth finally grew into the role of the future queen. The trips were not only diplomatically significant, but also personally formative. Elizabeth got to know the diversity of the Commonwealth, saw cultures, landscapes, and people that were very different from her homeland. For a princess who had grown up in a rather sheltered environment, the world opened up. She understood that her future role would not only be Queen of Great Britain, but that she would have to act as a symbol of a global network of nations. At the same time, her family began to grow. In 1948, their first son Charles was born, the future King Charles III. 2 years later, Princess Anne followed. For Elizabeth, this meant a new challenge, the balance between motherhood and representation duties. Unlike many women of her time, she was not able to raise her children herself. Care was largely in the hands of nannies and governesses, while Elizabeth commuted between family life and public obligations. Nevertheless, her love for her children was deep, and she tried to be present for them despite the burdens of being a princess. The late 1940s and early 1950s were a school of responsibility for Elizabeth. She learned how to give speeches, how to receive statesmen, how to make diplomatic statements without wasting words. Her seriousness impressed many who felt she was amazingly mature for her age. She knew that her father would not be able to rule much longer, and she prepared herself to follow in his footsteps. But in the midst of these obligations, she also retained a human side. Contemporary witnesses reported that Elizabeth could laugh heartily in private, that she appreciated humor, and that Philip was often the one who made her giggle. She loved to ride her horses, take care of her dogs, and put aside the heaviness of duty for moments in the company of her closest confidants. Nevertheless, it was clear that the time of relative freedom was coming to an end. Her father's illness progressed, and Elizabeth had to stand in for him more and more often. In 1951, she took over almost all of his tasks. In February 1952, she embarked on a trip to Kenya with Philip, a trip she would never forget. Because, while she was in Africa, the news reached her that her father had died. At that moment, she was no longer Princess Elizabeth, but Queen Elizabeth II. The first years as a princess were therefore not only a phase of preparation, but also a decisive transition. She had learned what it meant to live a life in the service of others. She had understood the importance of travel, diplomacy, and public presence, and she had made a promise she would never break, to dedicate her whole life to the crown. So this time was the bridge between childhood and the crown, between private happiness and public duty. During this phase, Elizabeth finally grew into the role that would make her the most important monarch of the 20th and early 21st century.
Chapter 8: The Death of King George VI and Elizabeth's Accession to the Throne. February 1952 marks a turning point in the history of Great Britain and in the life of Elizabeth Windsor. What began as another journey through the Commonwealth turned into one of the most decisive moments of the 20th century within hours. The princess became queen, not in a solemn ceremony, but in a hotel room in Kenya, far from home, by the sudden news of her father's death. King George VI had been seriously ill for years. His body was weakened by smoking, his lungs were suffering, and doctors had already removed parts of his organ. The nation knew he was in a bad way, but the true extent of his illness remained hidden. For Elizabeth, the responsibility had become ever greater. She represented him at state events, took on official duties, and traveled on his behalf. Nevertheless, the family held on to the hope that George VI could recover.
In January 1952, Elizabeth and Philip embarked on an extensive Commonwealth tour, which first led to Kenya. There, they moved into the famous Treetops Lodge, a hotel on stilts in the middle of the wilderness. In the diaries of the companions, it is later noted that Elizabeth seemed happy, relaxed, and full of confidence during these days. No one suspected that these were her last hours as a princess. On February 6, 1952, the news reached the British entourage. King George VI had died in his sleep at Sandringham. He was only 56 years old. For Elizabeth, this news meant a turning point. In the morning, she had enjoyed the African sun as a daughter and princess. In the evening, she was Queen of Great Britain and head of the Commonwealth. Her life had changed irrevocably without her being prepared for it. The moment the news was delivered to her was marked by deep seriousness. Elizabeth reacted calmly, with the self-discipline that would characterize her whole life. Her first question is said to have been, "What names should I take?" by which she asked for the name of the throne. She simply chose Elizabeth II, without digression, without adornment. It was an expression of their pragmatism and their desire to maintain continuity. The return trip to Great Britain was hastily organized. When Elizabeth landed in London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill was waiting for her at the airport. Churchill, a man of monumental personality, was deeply moved. He later wrote that the young woman he saw boarding the plane had a new aura from one moment to the next, no longer the princess, but the queen. This metamorphosis, as many contemporary witnesses reported, was palpable, almost tangible. Elizabeth grew into her role at that moment, not through preparation, but through the force of circumstances. The first days of her reign were overshadowed by deep grief. She had lost her father, whom she loved more than anything else, and at the same time, she had to accept the crown. The protocol knew no break. George VI's coffin was buried in a state funeral, and in the first hours of her reign, Elizabeth appeared before her people as queen. It was a double farewell, to her father and to her own role as daughter, wife, and young mother. From then on, she was a symbol, head of state, queen. The reactions in the country were marked by a mixture of sadness and hope. The population loved George VI because he had stayed by their side during the war, and his death hit them hard. At the same time, many saw Elizabeth as a fresh young queen who embodied a new era. At the age of 25, she stood for modernity, for a future after the hard post-war years. Pictures of her on the balcony of Buckingham Palace went around the world and raised expectations that could hardly be fulfilled. She was to become the face of a new era. But the beginning of her reign was not only a personal and national caesura, but also a global one. With her ascension to the throne, Elizabeth became monarch of more than a dozen countries, from Canada to Australia, from New Zealand to South Africa. The British Empire was in a state of upheaval, and the new queen had to find a balance between tradition and the growing striving for independence in the colonies from the very beginning. For Elizabeth herself, this transition meant an abrupt change in everyday life. The relatively carefree time in Malta, where she had led a halfway normal life with Philip, was finally over. From now on, there was no longer any place to retreat. Every step, every gesture, every word was observed. Philip, who had hoped to continue his naval career, had to give up his own ambitions to stand by the Queen's side. For him, too, the death of his father-in-law was a break. The independent officer became the prince consort, a role he accepted with mixed feelings. The first months of her reign were marked by adaptation. Elizabeth had to learn to manage the daily rhythm of a head of state, reading files, receiving ministers, and performing ceremonies. She was fortunate to have a prime minister at her side in Churchill who had experience and authority. Churchill, initially skeptical of the young queen, soon developed great respect for her. He realized that, despite her age, she possessed a remarkable seriousness that enabled her to bear the burden of the crown. Her rise was also followed with great attention internationally. In the USA, France, India, and many other countries, newspapers reported on the young queen, who seemed like a symbol of hope. Her picture graced front pages, her voice sounded in radio speeches, and her attitude impressed even experienced politicians. She was not only queen of a weekend but traditional country, but also a global figure who stood at the center of a network of nations. At the same time, Elizabeth experienced the human price of this role. Her private life took a back seat. She was only 25, mother of 2 small children, but from now on, public life took preeminence over everything. The balance between motherhood and crown was difficult, often painful. Charles and Anne grew up under the care of nannies, while their mother was tied up in state affairs. This distance shaped the relationship with her children and was later to cause conflicts. The death of King George VI was therefore not only a personal loss, but a key moment in history. It made Elizabeth queen at a moment when she may not have been emotionally ready, but when she nevertheless accepted the responsibility, without hesitation, without complaint. From that day on, her life was irrevocably dedicated to the service of the crown and the people. The scene in Kenya, where she fell asleep as a princess and woke up as a queen, is still a symbol of the sudden, almost fateful force with which the story forces people into their roles. Elizabeth accepted the role with the discipline, seriousness, and calmness that would shape her legacy.
Chapter 9. The Coronation, 1953. Symbolism and Hope. June 2, 1953, was a day that has burned itself into the collective memory of Great Britain and far beyond. Millions of people followed the events in Westminster Abbey spellbound. Many more all over the world who, thanks to modern technology, had the opportunity for the first time to witness a coronation not only through newspaper reports or radio broadcasts, but also in moving pictures. The coronation of Queen Elizabeth II was not just a religious ritual, but a political and cultural event of global significance, a moment that marked an era. For centuries, the coronation has been the most visible sign of a new monarch's assumption of power. But in the 20th century, it had an additional symbolic power. It was no longer just a dynastic ritual, but a means of anchoring the monarchy in a modern world. Elizabeth knew this responsibility, and she approached the preparations with the seriousness that had already become her trademark. The mourning for King George VI had hardly died down when planning for the coronation began. Traditions must be preserved, but also new accents must be set. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, in particular, recognized that the coronation was a moment that could boost the nation's self-confidence. Britain had survived the Second World War, but the years that followed were marked by deprivation, economic difficulties, and the loss of colonial power. The country longed for an event that would bring back hope and pride. On the day of the coronation, hundreds of thousands of people lined the streets of London, despite rain and cool weather. Many had waited hours, even days, to catch a glimpse of the golden carriage that took the young queen from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey. The people cheered when Elizabeth, in a white dress and purple robe, entered the church with a firm face and yet visibly moved. The ceremony itself followed ancient rituals that date back to the Middle Ages. The Archbishop of Canterbury presided over the service, anointed the queen with holy oil, put the crown on her, and presented her with the insignia of power: the scepter, the orb, the sword. Every step was imbued with symbolism. The coronation was not just a political act, but a sacred act that involved the queen in a centuries-old tradition. And yet, this coronation was different from all the previous ones. It was broadcast on television. At Elizabeth's request, and against initial resistance from Churchill and other politicians, the monarchy opened its doors to the modern media world. Around 20 million Britons watched the ceremony live on television, many for the first time ever. As many households purchased a device especially for the event. Millions more worldwide followed the images. The monarchy had thus taken the step into the age of mass media. For the people, this meant a new closeness to the queen. They could see how she knelt, how she received her crown, how she made her vows, visibly moved. The images created an emotional bond that was stronger than any written word. Elizabeth instinctively understood that this opening was crucial for the future of the monarchy. It had to appear visible, tangible, modern, without losing its dignity. In addition to the religious dimension, the coronation also had immense political significance. The British Empire was in a phase of upheaval, and many colonies were striving for independence. With the coronation, Elizabeth not only became Queen of Great Britain, but also head of the Commonwealth, a community of nations that was to replace the crumbling empire. The message was clear. The monarchy did not want to appear as a relic of the past, but as a unifying element of a new global community. The symbolic power of this moment was also evident in the international attention. Delegations from all over the world took part. Statesmen and diplomats paid their respects to the young queen.
For many nations, Elizabeth was the face of a new era, young, female, determined, yet deeply rooted in tradition. In a world that was experiencing the Cold War and was divided between East and West, she seemed like a figure who stood above these opposites. For Elizabeth herself, the coronation was a moment of humility and commitment. In her memoirs, she later emphasized that on that day, she felt less like a victor than a servant of her people, her country, her crown. She accepted the insignia not as symbols of personal power, but as symbols of a task that she wanted to fulfill throughout her life. The day was also a turning point for the British people. After years of rationing, after the harshness of the war, the coronation was a celebration of colors, splendor, hope. People decorated their houses with flags, organized street festivals, celebrated together. The coronation was not only a religious ritual, but a folk festival that strengthened the sense of community. In the media, the young queen was soon referred to as the glimmer of hope, a ray of hope. Her youth, her beauty, her seriousness made her a figure of identification, especially for a generation that was looking for role models after the war. Of course, not everything was ideal. Critics asked whether a monarchy in the 20th century was still in keeping with the times. Some saw the splendor of the coronation as an anachronism at a time when many people lived in poverty. But the majority saw the coronation as a necessary sign. The monarchy offered orientation in a world that was changing rapidly. In retrospect, the coronation of 1953 was more than the beginning of a reign. It was a key cultural and political event that set the course for the future. Elizabeth II presented herself as a modern monarch who was willing to combine old traditions with the new possibilities of the media society. She did not take office in a palace shielded from the world, but in the living rooms of millions of people. And for Elizabeth herself, it was the day she finally accepted the burden and splendor of the crown. She stepped out of her father's shadow, from the role of daughter, wife, and mother, into the role of queen, with a promise she kept for the rest of her life: to serve the crown and her people until her last breath.
Chapter 10: Great Britain in the 1950s, Awakening and Tradition. The 1950s were a decade of transition for Britain, and in the midst of this period of upheaval, Queen Elizabeth II began her reign. While the country was still feeling the consequences of the Second World War, new developments began at the same time that permanently changed society, politics, and culture. It was a time that was characterized in equal measure by lack and hope, by tradition and new beginnings. For the young queen, these years meant a kind of acid test. She had to find her place in a nation torn between the past and the future. When Elizabeth ascended the throne in 1952, Britain was still a country of rationing. Although the war had been over for 7 years, there was a shortage in many places. Food stamps had only been abolished at the beginning of the decade, and many households were struggling with tight budgets. Cities such as London, Coventry, or Liverpool still showed the scars of the German bombing raids, with ruins and wastelands dominating the picture. People lived modestly, and everyday life was often hard. At the same time, however, confidence also grew. Reconstruction progressed, new housing estates were built, and the idea of a better future was in the air. Politically, the country was under the influence of the post-war reforms introduced by the Labour government under Clement Attlee. The National Health Service, NHS, had been founded, a health system that promised all citizens access to medical care. This was a revolutionary step that had a lasting impact on the welfare state. Education, welfare, and labor market policy were more heavily regulated in order to reduce social inequality. Elizabeth II, who herself had grown up in a world of privilege, learned during this time that her role was not to take sides, but to represent the country as a whole, whether rich or poor, conservative or progressive. At the same time, Britain's position in the world changed. The empire, once so powerful, was in the process of disintegrating. India had already gained independence in 1947, and other colonies followed. The Suez Canal crisis of 1956, when Britain joined forces with France and Israel to take military action against Egypt, relentlessly exposed the country's weakened international position.
The USA and the Soviet Union were the new superpowers, and London had to come to terms with the fact that its global supremacy was finally over. For the young queen, this meant that her role was not to rule an empire, but to represent a newly emerging Commonwealth, a looser federation of independent states. Despite these political and economic difficulties, the mood in the 1950s was not only one of renunciation. There were also moments of optimism and cultural renewal. The Coronation in 1953 was such an event. It brought millions of people together, gave them a sense of unity and pride. Street parties, decorated houses, spontaneous celebrations, all this showed that the monarchy was an emotional anchor for many Britons. Elizabeth was young, modern, beautiful, and she gave the feeling that the country was entering a new era. Everyday life in the 1950s reflected this mixture of tradition and change. Family life, neighborhood, and church festivals continued to play a major role. But at the same time, new influences came to the country. The first televisions found their way into living rooms, rock and roll and pop music conquered young people, and cinema brought American stars such as James Dean or Marilyn Monroe to Europe. The generation of post-war children began to detach themselves from the values of their parents and to develop their own ideas of freedom and lifestyle. For Elizabeth, this meant that as queen, she had to represent two worlds: the older generation, which valued tradition, order, and the fulfillment of duty, and the younger generation, which strove for self-realization, individuality, and modernity. She did this by filling her role with a mixture of dignity and restraint. She rarely spoke politically, she avoided controversy, but her presence, her clothing, her attitude were signs of continuity in a changing world. A defining event in this decade was the death of Winston Churchill as Prime Minister in 1955. When Churchill, the last great hero of the Second World War, resigned and was replaced by Anthony Eden. For Elizabeth, Churchill was more than just a head of government. He was a mentor who had supported her in the first years of her reign. His departure was a further step in the transition from the old to the new era. Elizabeth now had to learn to deal with a whole series of new prime ministers, an experience that would accompany her for the rest of her life. Privately, her family continued to grow. In 1960 and 1964, two more children, Andrew and Edward, were to follow, but by the 1950s, their lives were already strongly influenced by their first two children, Charles and Anne. Balancing family and duty remained a challenge. Critics later accused the Queen of not spending enough time with her children. But at the time, it was taken for granted that the monarch's duties took precedence. Another important topic of these years was the change in the relationship between the monarchy and the people. The televised broadcast of the coronation had brought the royal family closer to the people, and Elizabeth understood that the monarchy needed to be more transparent in the age of media. Their appearances were carefully staged, their clothing deliberately chosen, their gestures considered. She was no longer the unapproachable monarch of past centuries, but a queen who was present in people's living rooms, and precisely because of this, strengthened her authority. So the 1950s were a decade of balancing act. Britain was looking for its place in the world, society was struggling with tradition and modernity, and the queen had to find her way to combine the two. Elizabeth II accomplished this task by not trying to change the world, but by giving the world a face that radiated calm, consistency, and hope. Looking back, it becomes clear that the 1950s were the foundation of her reign. She learned that her role was not to provide quick fixes or answers, but to be a symbol of change. A symbol of the fact that despite all the changes, there are constants, and that the monarchy could be one of them.
Chapter 11. The Empire becomes the Commonwealth. Decolonization and change. When Elizabeth II ascended the throne in 1952, Great Britain was still the ruler of an empire that spanned all continents. On maps, the colonies shone in red. The empire seemed enormous and unshakable. But behind this facade, a process had long since begun that was to fundamentally change the face of the British Empire. Decolonization, which had already begun with India's independence in 1947,
accelerated in the decades that followed, and Elizabeth II became queen in a world that was rapidly transforming from imperial rule to global partnership. The post-war years had shown that Britain could no longer bear the burden of a world empire. Economically weakened, militarily exhausted, and politically increasingly shaped by the Cold War, the country was no longer able to control its colonies as it once did. In addition, strong independence movements arose in many of these areas, which invoked self-determination and national freedom. For millions of people in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, the empire was not a symbol of strength but a sign of colonial oppression. The young queen had to accept this development, even though she had always grown up with a deep sense of loyalty to the empire. Their understanding of monarchy was shaped by the idea of a community that combined tradition and history. But Elizabeth quickly realized that the time of imperial rule was over. The way into the future led through the Commonwealth, a new form of cooperation that was not based on coercion but on voluntariness. The Commonwealth of Nations, as it was officially called, was an attempt to transform the legacy of the empire into a partnership of independent states. Each country should have its own government, its own politics, its own identity, and yet remain united by common values and the symbolic figure of the Queen. Elizabeth took on this role with great seriousness. She understood that she was no longer the ruler of colonies, but the link of a community that allowed diversity. The 1950s and 1960s were the time when this change became particularly visible. Countries such as Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, and Tanzania in Africa, as well as states in the Caribbean, gained their independence. Nevertheless, many decided to remain part of the Commonwealth and recognize Elizabeth as its head. For the Queen, these journeys were of enormous importance. She visited the new states, took part in ceremonies, talked to their leaders, and showed respect for their newfound freedom. In Accra, the capital of Ghana, she danced with President Kwame Nkrumah in 1961, an image that went around the world and was seen as a sign that Britain accepted the new reality. At the same time, decolonization was not a straightforward or painless process. Conflicts, uprisings, and violence broke out in many regions. The Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, which was bloodily suppressed, or the independence movements in Malaya, showed that the end of the empire meant not only celebrations, but also bitter conflicts. Elizabeth herself stayed out of political decisions, but she was always present as a symbolic figure. Their task was to build bridges where political rifts arose. Decolonization also led to debates within Great Britain. Some mourned the empire, seeing its loss as a weakening of national identity. Others welcomed the independence of the colonies as a step towards a fairer world order. Elizabeth did not take a position in these discussions, but she embodied the idea that, despite the loss of its colonies, Britain could play a significant role, not as a ruler, but as a partner. The symbolic power of the Commonwealth was particularly important. For many of the newly independent states, Elizabeth II was more than just a distant monarch in London. She was a neutral figure who did not intervene directly in politics, but nevertheless represented a connection to a common history. Her visits to these countries were not mere formalities, but moments in which people felt taken seriously. She showed interest in local cultures, wore traditional clothing, listened attentively, and won hearts in the process, even if the political relationship remained complicated. In the decades that followed, the Commonwealth grew into a community of more than 50 states, in which together over 2 billion people lived. Elizabeth was the only constant for many of these people. Prime ministers came and went, systems changed, borders were redrawn, but the Queen stayed. In a way, it was the bracket that held this diversity together. For Elizabeth personally, this role was an enormous burden, but also a source of meaning. She traveled more often than any other monarch in history, to India, Pakistan, Australia, Canada, Caribbean island states, African countries. Everywhere they were received with a mixture of respect and curiosity. For many people, it was the embodiment of a connection that had long since been imperial but had grown historically. Of course, the relationship was not always free of tension. In the 1970s and 1980s, for example, apartheid policy in South Africa divided the Commonwealth. Many states called for decisive action, while the British government under Margaret Thatcher pursued a more cautious course. Elizabeth stayed out of politics as usual, but it is said that she personally sympathized with the opponents of apartheid. Their task was to preserve the unity of the Commonwealth even when political differences threatened it. So, the Queen of the Empire became the Queen of the Commonwealth, a role that had less power but no less importance. Elizabeth II understood that she did not rule over territories but watched over relationships. Her life's work was to strengthen this community and to give it continuity through her person. Looking back, it can be said that without Elizabeth, the Commonwealth would probably not have been preserved in this form. Her diplomatic skills, her willingness to listen, her ability to stand above the political dispute as a neutral symbol made her a unique figure of integration. It transformed the decline of the empire into the birth of a new idea, a voluntary community based on shared values and mutual respect. For Britain itself, this was a painful but necessary change. It had to learn that greatness no longer lay in imperial power, but in international cooperation. Elizabeth helped this process by tying the dignity of the monarchy not to the loss of the empire, but to the new task of connecting a diverse world.
Chapter 12. Family and Children. Charles, Anne, Andrew, Edward. Behind the facade of the monarchy, behind glamour and duty, there was always a private side for Elizabeth II, that of her mother. Her role as queen left her little room for a normal family life, and yet her children were a central element in her life, both a source of joy and the source of some worries. Charles, Anne, Andrew, and Edward grew up in the shadow of the crown as part of a family that was constantly in the spotlight, and their stories also reflect the tensions between tradition and modernity that accompanied their mother's reign. When Elizabeth ascended the throne in 1952, she was just 25 years old and the mother of two young children. Charles, born in 1948, was 4 years old. Anne, born in 1950, was just 2. Both spent their first years of life in a phase in which their parents were still able to share comparatively normal moments with each other, especially during their stays in Malta, where Philip served as a naval officer. But this normality ended abruptly with the death of King George VI and Elizabeth's accession to the throne. From now on, Charles and Anne were no longer just the children of a princess, but offspring of the monarch, and thus part of a system that determined their lives from the ground up. The relationship between Elizabeth and Charles has been marked by the burden of duty from the very beginning. Charles was the heir apparent, and his upbringing was always marked by this role. Even as a small child, he was prepared to become king one day. His governesses, teachers, and the institutions that shaped him treated him less as a child and more as a future monarch. Elizabeth herself, as much as she loved her son, often did not have the opportunity to give the closeness and warmth that she might have wanted. They took up state business, travel, and official duties. Many biographers later noted that Charles respected his mother, but often experienced her as emotionally distant. Princess Anne, on the other hand, developed a different relationship with her mother at an early age. As a second child, she was less burdened by the direct burden of the crown. She was considered lively, strong-willed, and pragmatic, qualities that Elizabeth appreciated, perhaps also because they were similar to her own nature in some respects. Anne developed a passion for equestrian sports, which she shared with her mother, and later became one of the most hard-working members of the royal family, tirelessly attending official appointments. In the 1960s, the family continued to grow. Prince Andrew was born in 1960, followed by Prince Edward in 1964. Elizabeth thus had 4 children who grew up in different phases of her reign. While Charles and Anne experienced the more conservative 1950s, Andrew and Edward grew up in the more liberal 1960s, when society was on the move. For Elizabeth, this meant that she was confronted with very different challenges as a mother. Andrew, often referred to as the Queen's favorite son, enjoyed a comparatively carefree childhood. He was born in a phase in which Elizabeth was already more confident in her role and perhaps found more room for family closeness. He later served as a helicopter pilot in the Royal Navy and made a name for himself through his service in the Falklands War in 1982.
but his later involvement in scandals and controversial friendships was to overshadow the image his mother had of him. Edward, the youngest, was long considered the quieter, more reserved of the four children. He first took an artistic path, working in film and theater production, before devoting himself more to the duties of the royal family. Elizabeth had a rather quiet, stable relationship with him, without the intensity of the conflicts she experienced with Charles or Andrew. For all four children, Elizabeth's role as a mother was extraordinary. Unlike many mothers of that time, she did not spend many hours with them every day. Their obligations meant that nannies, governesses, and boarding schools took over much of the education. Charles, in particular, perceived this as a distance, which later became a topic in interviews and biographies. At the same time, Elizabeth was convinced that her task as queen came first, and that her children were still in good hands through the care of others. Education in boarding schools was a formative element for the royal children. Charles, for example, attended Gordonstoun, a school in Scotland known for its strict, almost military discipline. While Philip found this school to be formative and empowering, Charles suffered from loneliness and bullying there. Elizabeth heard her son's complaints, but was persuaded by Philip that toughness was good for his development. This episode exemplifies how difficult it was for her to find the balance between maternal care and royal distance. At the same time, the family was always a retreat for Elizabeth. In Windsor, Balmoral, or Sandringham, she experienced moments of normality. Picnics, walks, horseback rides. These private times were rare but invaluable to the Queen. She loved to play with her dogs, to be outdoors with the children, and to be a mother instead of a queen for short hours. But the tensions between duty and family remained a common thread. As their children grew up, public attention increased, and every step the family took was commented on. Charles' complicated personality, Anne's idiosyncrasy, Andrew's thirst for adventure, Edward's restraint, all of this became the stuff of headlines. Elizabeth tried to protect her children from the worst public pressure, but the interest was unstoppable. In retrospect, it turns out that Elizabeth's relationship with her children was never easy. She loved them, but she couldn't give them the closeness that was expected of a normal mother. Her role as queen did not allow it. Some of her children suffered from it, others came to terms with it. For Elizabeth herself, it was a lifelong tension that she could never completely resolve. And yet, her family was indispensable to her. In the moments of greatest crises, be it in political scandals or in personal burdens, her children were part of her support. Even though the relationships were often complicated, they remained the private foundation of a woman who outwardly played the role of the unshakable queen. Thus, the story of Charles, Anne, Andrew, and Edward was not only a family saga, but also a mirror of the monarchy itself. She showed the difficulties of combining tradition with modernity, closeness with distance, duty with feeling. For Elizabeth II, enduring these tensions was one of the greatest challenges of her life, and she did it with the same discipline that distinguished her in all other areas.
Chapter 13. The Queen of Modernism. Television, Media, and Public Appearances. A monarchy lives from images. It thrives on symbols, rituals, and the ability to arouse emotions without immersing herself in everyday politics. Queen Elizabeth II understood this better than any other monarch of her time. From the beginning of her reign, she used modern media, first radio, then television, and finally the internet, to make the crown visible, tangible, and present. She thus became the Queen of Modernism, who did not retreat in a world of technological change, but gradually accepted the new possibilities. Her coronation in 1953 was already a milestone in this respect. For the first time, a coronation ceremony was broadcast live on television. Millions of people watched the festivities in their living rooms. Many had bought a television set especially for this purpose. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in the monarchy. It was no longer a distant mystery, but part of people's everyday lives. It was Elizabeth herself who insisted on allowing the cameras, although Prime Minister Winston Churchill was initially skeptical. She realized that visibility was the basis of trust, and that a modern monarchy could not survive without media presence. In the decades that followed, television became one of the most important instruments of her reign.
Her Christmas speeches, which had been held by her grandfather George V over the radio since 1932, were broadcast on television for the first time in 1957. In her first televised address, she addressed the people directly, looked into the camera, and millions of viewers had the feeling that the Queen was speaking to them personally. It was a moment of intimate closeness that at the same time bridged the distance of the institution. The Queen knew how to carefully stage her public presence. Her clothes, her gestures, her tone of voice, everything was deliberate and targeted. Colored hats and coats ensured that she was easily recognizable even in large crowds. Her speeches were sober, without pathos, but always carried by seriousness. It was precisely this restraint that made them credible. It avoided political statements, but it conveyed values, a sense of duty, stability, cohesion. As the media world grew, so did the number of public appearances. Elizabeth completed over 21,000 appointments during her reign, from state banquets to school attendance. Every event, big or small, was part of their strategy to remain visible. She traveled tirelessly through the country, visited villages and towns, talked to workers, students, and the sick. The images of these encounters went through the newspapers, later through television, and finally through the internet. It conveyed the feeling that the monarchy did not only take place in palaces, but was part of people's lives. But the new media brought not only opportunities, but also challenges. With the rise of television, the royal family has come under greater scrutiny than ever. In the 1960s, Elizabeth allowed cameras to make a documentary about the private lives of the royals for the first time. Royal Family, broadcast in 1969, showed the Queen at breakfast, at a barbecue in Balmoral, talking to her children. It was an attempt to create closeness and modernize the image of the monarchy. But the effect was ambivalent. Although millions of viewers saw the royals in an unaccustomed naturalness, at the same time, the monarchy lost some of its mystical distance. Elizabeth herself is said to have later regretted having allowed the project. In the decades that followed, the media landscape continued to intensify. With the tabloid press, which flourished in the 1980s and 90s, the private lives of the royals were mercilessly exploited. In particular, the relationship between Prince Charles and Princess Diana became a constant topic in the headlines. For Elizabeth, this meant that she had to define her role even more. She was not allowed to be part of the scandals, but had to stand above them. During this time, her reputation developed as an unshakable, stoic figure who never allowed herself to be provoked. Even in the 21st century, Elizabeth showed an amazing ability to adapt. She accepted that the internet and social media would become new channels of communication. In 1997, the official website of Buckingham Palace went online. In 2014, the Queen published her first tweet, followed by her first Instagram post in 2019. These steps were symbolic, but they showed that the monarchy did not stand still in the 20th century. Elizabeth understood that every generation had to see their queen, whether on TV, in the newspaper, or on their smartphone. At the same time, she remained true to her line. The Queen herself was never a star. She was not a celebrity who revealed private things. Her media presence has always served the institution, never the person. She understood that her greatest asset was the aura that surrounded her, an aura that allowed closeness but never complete familiarity. Their public appearances were marked by rituals that remained almost unchanged for decades. Trooping the Colour, the ceremonial military parade for her birthday, the opening of Parliament with crown and robe, the state banquets with foreign state guests, all these events became an integral part of the British calendar. For many people, they were not only ceremonies, but fixed points in the course of the year. The images of these rituals, broadcast live on television, shaped the collective memory. But Elizabeth was not only queen of tradition, but also of gestures. Her visits to crisis areas, her meetings with ordinary people, her travels through the Commonwealth, all these were images that reached millions. She understood that her handshake, her smile, her presence said more than 1,000 words. So she became the Queen of Modernity, not because she introduced spectacular innovations, but because she found the balance between distance and proximity, between tradition and progress, between the mystery of the monarchy and the reality of a media world. If you take the pictures of her reign together, the young queen at her coronation on black and white television, the mother and grandmother in the color television age, the over 90-year-old on Instagram, then a unique path emerges. Elizabeth II was the face of an institution that had to reinvent itself in the 20th and 21st centuries. And she did this by embracing the power of images without losing herself in them.
Chapter 14. Years of Crisis, 1970s, 1980s, Economic and Political Upheaval. The 1970s and 1980s were decades that deeply shook Britain. Economic crises, social tensions, and political upheavals shaped the country. For Queen Elizabeth II, this time meant a special challenge. She had to lead the monarchy through stormy waters without becoming involved in the political disputes herself. It was a phase in which its role as a symbol of stability became particularly important, and in which the crown's resilience was put to the test several times. At the beginning of the 1970s, Great Britain was facing major economic problems. The post-war order, which had hoped for growth and prosperity, reached its limits. The oil crisis in 1973 led to massive price increases and energy shortages. The government imposed power cuts, factories had to close, and public life was restricted. Images of power outages, idle assembly lines, and demonstrations characterized the decade. The winter of discontent of 1978-79, when strikes paralyzed the country, symbolized the deep loss of trust in politics. Elizabeth II was not allowed to take sides in such crises. She did not talk about economic policy or trade union struggles, but their presence conveyed a sense of continuity. While prime ministers came and went, while governments failed, she stayed. This constancy was an anchor for many people, especially at a time when society was undergoing profound changes. The 1970s were not only economically difficult, but also culturally marked by ruptures. New movements questioned old certainties: the women's movement, the peace movement, the growing youth culture. The monarchy, which traditionally stood for permanence, had to find its place in this changed society. Elizabeth responded by not changing herself. Her continuity was her strength. But at the same time, she cautiously opened up the royal family to new influences, for example, through more modern appearances, more travel, and stronger media presence. In the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher became the first woman to take office as Prime Minister. Thatcher and Elizabeth were opposites in many ways. One, a political fighter, characterized by clear ideologies and hard determination; the other, a reserved, neutral symbolic figure. Their relationship was not always easy. While Thatcher led the country through her free market revolution, through tough cuts and confrontations with the trade unions, Elizabeth remained in her role as a unifying element. Press reports repeatedly speculated about tensions between the two women, for example, about how to deal with the Commonwealth or social issues. Whether the rumors were exaggerated or not, they showed that the monarchy had to maintain a delicate balance during this phase. A decisive event in the 1980s was the Falklands War in 1982. When Argentina occupied the British Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic, the Thatcher government reacted with military force. The Queen did not support the mission politically, but her role was nevertheless significant. Prince Andrew, her son, served as a helicopter pilot in this war. Elizabeth had to find the balance between caring for her child and her duty to maintain neutrality. For many Britons, the victory over Argentina became a moment of national pride, and the Queen stood as a symbol over that triumph. But while the country celebrated victories in foreign policy, internal tensions remained. Unemployment, poverty in the industrial regions, the bloody clashes in Northern Ireland, all this weighed on the nation. The IRA carried out attacks that also directly affected the royal family. In 1979, Lord Mountbatten, a close relative and mentor of Prince Charles, was killed by an IRA bomb. For Elizabeth, this was a personal shock that showed how close terror itself could come to the crown. In the midst of these crises, the perception of the monarchy also changed. The crown was still considered a symbol of unity, but people began to take a closer look. Questions about the costs of the royal family, about its role in a modern democracy, became louder. At the same time, interest in the private lives of the royals increased, a development that received enormous attention due to the wedding of Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer in 1981.
Millions of people around the world watched the ceremony, which was celebrated as a fairy tale wedding. For the monarchy, it was a triumph of images, a moment in which tradition and modernity seemed to unite. But this shine was soon to crack, a topic that will be dealt with in detail in the following chapters. For Elizabeth, the 1980s meant that she had to fulfill her role more and more in the field of tension between public expectation and private reality. In retrospect, the 1970s and 1980s can be described as the touchstone of her reign. These were decades full of tensions: economic crises, social unrest, terrorism, international conflicts. The monarchy could easily have lost its importance in these times, but Elizabeth managed to preserve them through her calm and constancy. She did not do this through big words or gestures, but through presence. By staying while everything else changed, it became the fixed point of a society that was looking for support. Thus, the crisis years were not only a time of challenges for Elizabeth II, but also a phase in which her importance as a symbol became clearer than ever. She was not the solution to the country's problems, but she was the face that conveyed confidence, and that was exactly where her strength lay. Chapter 15: Diana and the Windsors: Marital Crises and Scandals. When you think of the most moving and at the same time most difficult years of Queen Elizabeth II's reign, there is no way around Princess Diana. The marriage between Charles, the heir to the throne, and Diana Spencer was not just a private relationship, but an event of worldwide significance. But behind the fairy tale facade was a drama that shook the monarchy, had a lasting impact on the image of the royal family, and plunged the Queen into one of the greatest crises of her life. When Prince Charles married Diana in 1981, the euphoria was huge. Millions of people around the world watched the wedding on television, and the media celebrated Diana as the Princess of Hearts. She was young, beautiful, shy, and many saw her as a modern addition to the traditional monarchy. The connection seemed to be made to give the crown a new shine. For Elizabeth II, it was a moment of pride. The heir to the throne was married, the dynasty seemed secure. But it soon became clear that the marriage between Charles and Diana was anything but a fairy tale. Different characters, age differences, different expectations, all of this led to tension. Charles was shaped by his love for Camilla Parker Bowles, which he had never given up, while Diana felt increasingly lonely in the role of the princess. Behind the palace walls, a drama developed that the public soon noticed. The media played a central role in this. Diana was the darling of the press from the beginning. Her style, her openness, her closeness to the people made her the antithesis of the monarchy, which often seemed distant. While Elizabeth relied on restraint and dignity, Diana showed emotion, spoke about her problems, and was publicly involved in charitable causes such as the fight against AIDS or the fight against landmines. The press portrayed her as the Queen of Hearts, and in the same breath as a rival to the actual queen. For Elizabeth, this situation was highly complex. On the one hand, she felt sympathy for Diana, who was under enormous pressure. On the other hand, she knew that her son's marital crisis was not only a private problem, but a threat to the institution of the monarchy. In the 1980s and 90s, headlines about embezzlement, disputes, and scandals piled up. Telephone recordings, investigative books, interviews, all of this made the Windsors' conflicts public. Diana's famous interview with the BBC in 1995 in particular shook the monarchy. She spoke openly about her husband's infidelity, about her eating disorders, about her loneliness in the palace. Her sentence, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded," alluding to Camilla, went around the world. For Elizabeth, this was a shock because it exposed the most intimate problems of the royal family to the whole world. In the midst of this crisis, the Queen had to make decisions that had far-reaching consequences. At first, she had hoped that Charles and Diana could overcome their differences, but finally she realized that a divorce was inevitable. In 1996, the marriage was officially divorced, an unprecedented event in the history of the British monarchy, which traditionally focused on stability and continuity. But the real low point was yet to come. On August 31, 1997, Diana died in a car accident in Paris, pursued by paparazzi. The news triggered shock and grief worldwide. Millions of people made pilgrimages to Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace to lay flowers. The public sympathy took on proportions that no one had expected. And here the Queen herself came under criticism. Elizabeth had retreated to Balmoral with her family after the accident to protect her grandsons, William and Harry. But the public interpreted her absence as coldness, as distance, as a lack of empathy. The headlines became sharper and sharper. "Where is our Queen?" asked the press. Many people felt that the monarchy did not share the pain felt by the people. It was only when Elizabeth returned to London after a few days, stood in front of the sea of flowers, gave a speech live on television, and paid tribute to Diana that the mood changed. Her words were brief but significant. She spoke as both queen and grandmother, and she made it clear that Diana would have a lasting place in the nation's memory. This speech, which was made under great pressure, is considered one of the most important appearances of her reign. It saved the reputation of the monarchy in a critical situation. The episode around Diana showed how vulnerable even such a traditional institution as the British monarchy could be. The Queen had to realize that restraint and distance were not always the right answer. In a media society in which emotions and images were decided, the monarchy also had to learn to appear more human, more approachable. Looking back, the story of Diana and the Windsors was one of the greatest tests for Elizabeth II. It posed questions to the monarchy that reached deep into its existence. Can an institution based on tradition and duty survive in a world that demands authenticity, feelings, and openness? Elizabeth II found the answer by seeking balance. It remained the symbol of permanence, but it allowed the monarchy to take on more human features. So the years with Diana were not only a phase of crisis, but also a turning point. They showed the dark side of the media age, the dangers of scandals, and the fragility of the royal image. But they also made it clear that a monarchy can survive if it is willing to adapt, and that was Elizabeth's strength.
Chapter 16. The Annus Horribilis, 1992. For Queen Elizabeth II, 1992 was a turning point, a year that was indelibly imprinted on her reign. It was a year full of crises, scandals, and personal disappointments, which ultimately went down in history, in her own words, as her Annus Horribilis, her terrible year. Never before had she spoken so openly about the burdens of her role. Never before had the monarchy seemed so shaken. Already at the beginning of the year, it became apparent that it would be difficult. Several marriages in the royal family broke up or fell into serious crises, a nightmare for an institution that was supposed to embody stability and continuity on the outside. In March, Princess Anne announced her divorce from Mark Phillips. Anne, the Queen's only daughter, was always considered pragmatic and down-to-earth. Their marriage had been strained for years, but the official separation was still a shock to the public. It showed that marriages could fail even in the royal family, a taboo break at a time when divorce was still strongly stigmatized. Shortly afterwards, Prince Andrew followed, who separated from his wife Sarah Ferguson, known as Fergie. Their marriage had been marked by difficulties from the beginning, and in 1992 a scandal broke out when photos of Fergie in compromising situations with another man were leaked to the press. The headlines were merciless, and the monarchy faced ridicule and criticism. But the crisis around Prince Charles and Princess Diana weighed most heavily. Their marriage had long since ended, but in 1992 the public dispute reached a new peak. In November, journalist Andrew Morton published the book Diana, Her True Story, which was based on secret tape recordings of the princess. In it, Diana described her eating disorders, her loneliness in the palace, and her husband's affair with Camilla Parker Bowles. The book hit like a bomb. For the first time, the deepest abysses of the royal family were exposed in public, an unprecedented scandal. The crowning glory of the drama followed a few weeks later, when secretly recorded phone calls between Charles and Camilla were leaked to the press, the so-called Camillagate affair. The intimate conversations were exploited by the press and made Charles ridiculous in the eyes of many. For Elizabeth, this was a slap in the face. The heir to the throne himself, the future of the monarchy, was involved in a scandal that massively damaged the reputation of the crown.
As if this were not enough, the Queen was also confronted with another disaster, a devastating fire at Windsor Castle in November 1992. The fire destroyed large parts of the historic apartments, including St. George's Hall and the private chapel. Hundreds of firefighters fought the flames for hours. Valuable works of art and furniture were saved at the last minute. The images of the smoking walls went around the world and became a symbol of the decline of the royal family that year. In addition, the question of financing the reconstruction caused outrage. Many Britons living in a time of economic hardship reacted with anger when it became known that taxpayers' money was to go into restoration. The public debate finally led to the Queen taking a historic step. For the first time, she agreed to pay income tax and limit the costs for the royal family more. It was a pragmatic but also humiliating reaction to public pressure. All these events culminated in a speech Elizabeth gave in November 1992 on the occasion of her 40th anniversary on the throne. Normally, such speeches were solemn, full of retrospectives and thanksgiving. But this time, the Queen chose unusually personal words. She spoke of an annus horribilis, a terrible year, and thus made it clear how much she herself had suffered from the events. It was a rare openness that surprised many. Elizabeth, who otherwise always exercised restraint, gave an insight into her human vulnerability. The speech was a balancing act. On the one hand, it showed that the Queen recognized the problems and did not ignore them. On the other hand, she remained true to her role while still maintaining dignity and seriousness. This mixture helped to smooth the waves, but confidence in the monarchy was shaken. In retrospect, 1992 is considered the year in which the modern monarchy was forced to change. The scandals had shown that the public demanded transparency, that the royals were no longer unassailable symbols, but people with flaws and weaknesses. For Elizabeth, this meant that she had to redefine her role, no longer only as an untouchable monarch, but also as a woman who withstood the storms of modernity. Despite all the crises, she survived the year, and the monarchy with her. It was proof that their strength lay not in the absence of problems, but in their ability to stand firm even in the worst storm. The annus horribilis was a painful experience for Elizabeth, but it made it clear why she was revered as a symbol of constancy and perseverance.
Chapter 17: Elizabeth II and Globalization. Travel, Diplomacy, Worldwide Symbolism. One of the most outstanding features of Queen Elizabeth II's reign was her ability to transcend boundaries, both geographically and symbolically. She was not only Queen of the United Kingdom, but also head of the Commonwealth, and thus a figure of worldwide importance. In an era marked by globalization, international networking, and global political upheaval, Elizabeth became a symbol that reached far beyond the borders of her country. From the beginning of her reign, she understood that travel would be a central part of her mission. No other monarch in history has visited as many countries as Elizabeth II. She completed more than 260 trips abroad, visited over 110 different countries, and covered millions of kilometers. Their state visits were more than diplomatic routine. They were signs of friendship, respect, and stability. The early decades of her reign were marked by the construction of the Commonwealth. Elizabeth traveled to India, Australia, Canada, Ghana, Nigeria, and many other countries that had gained independence. She made it clear that she did not come as a ruler of colonies, but as a partner in a community of sovereign states. Her visit to Ghana in 1961 is considered particularly formative. Despite security concerns, she insisted on visiting the young state and appearing in public at the site of President Kwame Nkrumah. The images of her dancing with him went around the world, a strong signal that Britain accepted the new realities. She also became a central figure in Australia and Canada. Her trips to these countries were accompanied by enthusiasm. Hundreds of thousands of people lined the streets to catch a glimpse of them. In Australia, for example, in 1954, over 1 million people welcomed the Queen to Sydney, almost half of the country's population at the time. This enthusiasm showed that Elizabeth II was not only perceived as a distant monarch, but as a unifying symbol. But their travels were not limited to the Commonwealth. It also expanded diplomatic relations with other states. In 1965, she became the first British monarch to officially visit Germany since World War II.
Her visit to the Federal Republic of Germany was of enormous symbolic importance. It marked a reconciliation between two countries that had been bitter enemies only 2 decades earlier. She was received with great honor in France, the USA, Japan, and many other countries. Her role was always the same. She did not interfere in political decisions, but embodied continuity and respect. She was an interlocutor who did not negotiate, but cultivated relationships. Many heads of state, from Charles de Gaulle to Barack Obama, later reported on their extraordinary ability to listen and to build trust through their presence. With growing globalization in the late decades of the 20th century, their role became even more important. The world was moving closer together, international organizations were gaining in importance, and Elizabeth was a constant in the midst of these networks. While presidents, chancellors, and prime ministers came and went, she stayed. Her person was a fixed point in a world of change. Especially during the Cold War, their symbolic role played a subtle but not insignificant role. While the major political issues between Washington and Moscow were being decided, the Queen in London provided a stage for dialogue and encounter. State visits to the United Kingdom were enhanced by her presence, and her neutrality made her an ideal hostess. She continued this tradition in the 21st century. Her state visit to Ireland in 2011 was a milestone of reconciliation. For decades, tensions between Britain and Ireland had strained relations, but Elizabeth's visit, during which she laid wreaths for the victims of British and Irish violence, was seen as a historic step. Her words in Gaelic greeting the Irish people touched millions and showed that she had the power to heal old wounds. Their global symbolic power was also evident in their reactions to personal events. When she celebrated her Diamond Jubilee in 2012, celebrations took place not only in London, but worldwide. Buildings were lit up in the colors of the British flag, and people in Australia, Canada, India, and South Africa organized festivals to honor their queen. This was not just loyalty to a monarch, but an expression of the fact that Elizabeth II had become a figure of global identity. At the same time, she knew how to present the monarchy in a globalized media world. Her travels were broadcast live, her appearances shared on social platforms, and she became one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. Even people who had no special connection to Britain recognized her and associated it with terms such as stability, tradition, and dignity. However, her role was not free of criticism. Some saw relics of an imperial past in their travels. Others asked whether the monarchy still had any function at all in a globalized world. But Elizabeth did not meet these questions with debate, but with perseverance. She kept on traveling, she kept appearing, she kept smiling, and that's exactly what made her so effective. In the end, it was this tireless presence that made it so symbolic worldwide. Elizabeth II was not a politician, she was not a reformer, she was not a revolutionary, but she was there. For decades, in hundreds of countries, in thousands of encounters, she was the face of a monarchy that redefined its role from rule over an empire to partnership in a global world. So, Elizabeth II became the queen of globalization, not because she made laws or negotiated treaties, but because she embodied what was so rare in an interconnected world: consistency.
Chapter 18, 2002, The Golden Jubilee and the New Challenges. The year 2002 marked another milestone in Queen Elizabeth II's reign. 50 years had passed since she ascended the throne in 1952, 5 decades of political upheaval, personal trials, and historic changes. Her Golden Jubilee was supposed to be a celebration of joy and pride, but it began with loss and grief. It was precisely this mixture of pain and celebration that made the Jubilee year a symbol of Elizabeth's entire reign, marked by setbacks but sustained by the ability to maintain dignity and constancy. Already at the beginning of the year, the Queen was hit by 2 heavy blows of fate. On February 9th, her sister, Princess Margaret, died at the age of only 71. Margaret had been a close but also difficult companion throughout her life, glamorous, rebellious, sometimes scandalous. Her death left a void in the family and reminded Elizabeth of how much time had passed since her own youth. Just a few weeks later, on March 30, the Queen Mother, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, died at the age of 101. The Queen Mum had been a central figure of the monarchy for decades,
popular with the people, respected for her stance in the Second World War. For the Queen, her death meant a particularly painful loss because her mother had always been her support and advisor. This grief overshadowed the beginning of the anniversary year. Some wondered whether an atmosphere of celebration could be created at all. But this is exactly where Elizabeth's special ability once again became apparent: to draw strength from personal setbacks for her public role. She decided not to make the Jubilee a purely festive event, but an opportunity to reconnect with her people. The festivities began in June 2002 with a series of events that covered the entire country. Street festivals, parades, church services, and concerts made it clear that, despite all the crises of the 1990s, the monarchy was still deeply rooted in the lives of the British. The highlight was the Party at the Palace concert in front of Buckingham Palace, where stars such as Paul McCartney and Elton John performed. Millions of people watched the spectacle live on television, and hundreds of thousands gathered in London to celebrate together. For many, it was a symbol. The monarchy had survived difficult times and was still a link for the nation. Particularly impressive was the moment when the light show over Buckingham Palace ended with the anthem "God Save the Queen," and the Queen herself appeared on the balcony. She seemed serious, almost thoughtful, and yet she radiated the dignity she had embodied for decades. It was not an exuberant performance, but a sign of quiet continuity, and that is exactly what made it so effective. The anniversary also had an international dimension. Elizabeth used the year to visit many countries of the Commonwealth again. Her travels have taken her to Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and numerous Caribbean countries. She was received with enthusiasm everywhere, and the celebration showed that her role as head of the Commonwealth still mattered. Especially at a time when some questioned the relevance of this community, the anniversary was a strong signal. The monarchy could have an impact beyond national borders. But the year 2002 was not only a retrospective, but also a turning point. The Queen was now 76 years old, and many wondered how long she could keep up her workload. At the same time, the question of the future of the monarchy came to the fore. Prince Charles had been heir to the throne for decades, but his popularity had declined after the scandal surrounding his marriage to Diana. Many people wondered if the crown would one day pass directly to Prince William, the Queen's eldest grandson. Elizabeth herself did not get involved in such speculation. She made it clear again and again that she would wear the crown until her death. Another central theme of the anniversary year was the role of the monarchy in a modern society. Critics accused the institution of being anachronistic and costly, but the celebration showed that the emotional attachment of many people to the crown was unbroken. Streets full of people waving flags and celebrating together were proof that the monarchy still had a unifying force. Elizabeth also used the anniversary to re-emphasize her role. In her speeches, she spoke less about the past than about the future. She emphasized the importance of cohesion, community, and consistency in a rapidly changing world. These messages were perceived as authentic because they were in harmony with their entire lifestyle. Despite the success of the celebrations, 2002 was also a year that highlighted the fragility of the monarchy. The mourning for the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret was a reminder of the human price the Queen had to pay. At the same time, questions about Charles and the future of the House of Windsor made it clear that the monarchy could not rely on tradition alone. It had to justify again and again why it was relevant in the 21st century. In the end, the Golden Jubilee remained an ambivalent year, a year of mourning and celebration, of looking back and a new beginning. For Elizabeth II, it was further proof that her role was not to give simple answers, but to be the face of constancy. She stood above the turbulence, above the debates, above the doubts, not because she was untouched, but because she had the ability to keep her composure even in the most difficult moments. So 2002 was not only an anniversary, but a mirror of her reign, marked by losses and crises, but sustained by a dignity that created trust. The Golden Jubilee showed that Elizabeth II was more than just a relic of the past. She was a symbol of a present that needed support and a future that seemed hard to imagine without her.
Chapter 19: Elizabeth as a constant in the 21st century until the corona pandemic. In the new millennium, Queen Elizabeth II entered a phase of her reign that was marked by enormous changes. The world has been shaken by digitalization, terrorism, financial crises, and global pandemics. But in the midst of all these upheavals, it has remained the immovable constant:
Her age, experience, and constancy gave her a special authority that radiated far beyond Britain. The first years of the 21st century were a time of stabilization for the royal family. After the scandals of the 1990s, the death of Princess Diana, and the loss of confidence in the monarchy, Elizabeth had succeeded in consolidating the reputation of the crown. The Golden Jubilee in 2002 showed that the monarchy was still an integral part of the national consciousness. In the years that followed, the Queen continued this, through a mixture of continuity and careful modernization. One of the most formative events of this era was the terrorist attack of September 11, 2001 in the USA. Elizabeth reacted with a gesture that attracted worldwide attention. In front of Buckingham Palace, she had the American national anthem played, an unprecedented act of solidarity. In times of global uncertainty, the Queen showed that the monarchy could have an impact beyond national borders. The terrorist attacks in London on 7 July 2005 were also a moment in which its role as a symbol of unity became visible. She visited victims, spoke to the people, and conveyed calm in a situation that was marked by fear. The financial crisis of 2008 also posed a challenge to the monarchy. While banks collapsed and many Britons saw their existence threatened, the question of the costs of the monarchy was raised again. Elizabeth reacted with pragmatism. She reduced expenses and opened up parts of the royal finances to the public. Her Christmas address during this time emphasized cohesion and the importance of responsibility, words that resonated particularly well in view of the crisis. At the same time, her family continued to develop. Prince Charles came more into focus as heir to the throne, but the next generation, especially Prince William and Prince Harry, also gained in importance. The wedding of William and Catherine Middleton in 2011 became a global media event that gave the monarchy a modern face. Elizabeth herself seemed like the quiet matriarch in these moments, embodying continuity and at the same time enabling the transition to the future. Another highlight was the Diamond Jubilee in 2012, which marked 60 years of reign. Once again, the whole country celebrated, and street festivals, parades, and church services were on the agenda. Particularly impressive was the boat parade on the Thames, where hundreds of thousands cheered the Queen despite the pouring rain. The anniversary showed that Elizabeth had long been more than just a monarch. She had become a national icon who shaped the image of many Britons' own life stories. But the 21st century also brought new crises for the Windsor family. The decision of Prince Harry and his wife Meghan Markle to retire from their royal duties in 2020 shook the royal family. Media reports of tensions within the family, accusations of racism, and a lack of support put pressure on the monarchy. Elizabeth, as so often, with restraint. She spoke of Harry and Meghan remaining beloved family members and tried to find a way between tradition and flexibility. Probably the biggest challenge of the 21st century, however, was the corona pandemic from 2020 onwards. At a time when public life came to a standstill and millions of people around the world were uncertain, Elizabeth addressed the nation with a rare special address. On April 5, 2020, she spoke to her people from Windsor Castle. Only a few times in her reign had she made a direct address to the nation outside of the Christmas address. Her words, "We will meet again," a reference to Vera Lynn's famous World War II song, gave people comfort and hope. Many felt that this speech was the moral climax of her late reign. During the pandemic, the Queen became more withdrawn. She lived at Windsor Castle for a long time, largely shielded, and fulfilled many of her tasks digitally. Video conferences with members of the government, virtual meetings with organizations, and online speeches showed that she fulfilled her role even in this exceptional situation. Her ability to open up to new technologies, even in old age, was widely admired. At the same time, she experienced personal losses during these years. The death of Prince Philip in April 2021 hit her particularly hard. After more than 70 years of marriage, she suddenly found herself alone. The images of her lonely figure at the funeral service in St. George's Chapel, her head bowed, the mask on her face, they went around the world and became a symbol of the pain of the pandemic, which had taken away millions of loved ones. All these events made Elizabeth a constant in the 21st century more than ever. She was the one who stayed while everything else changed. In a world of uncertainty, she embodied continuity. Her advanced age, her decades of experience, her ability to keep her composure even in crises made her a unique figure. She was not only Queen of Great Britain, but a moral authority whose words carried weight, not through power, but through authority. In the 21st century, Elizabeth became a symbolic figure of a globalized, insecure world. It showed that consistency could be a value that gave people orientation. Until the corona pandemic, she remained one of the most important personalities in public life. Not through spectacular deeds, but through the simple fact that she was there, reliable, unshakable, always present.
Chapter 20. The End of an Era. Death, Legacy, and Succession. When Queen Elizabeth II celebrated her Platinum Jubilee in February 2022, she seemed almost timeless. She was on the throne for 70 years, longer than any other British monarch before her. Millions of people around the world honored her. Buildings were lit up in the colors of the Union Jack, festivals and parades celebrated her unprecedented reign. For many, it was unimaginable that a time would ever dawn without them. And yet, everyone knew. The day would come when the Elizabeth II era ended. On September 8, 2022, the time had come. At Balmoral Castle, her beloved retreat in Scotland, the Queen died peacefully at the age of 96. The news shook not only Britain, but the whole world. Within minutes, headlines appeared on all continents. People laid flowers, churches rang their bells. It was the end of an era, the end of a reign that had shaped generations. The reactions were overwhelming. Politicians, heads of state, and citizens from all over the world expressed their grief and recognition. U.S. President Joe Biden called her a stateswoman of incomparable dignity. French President Emmanuel Macron spoke of a queen of the heart. In the Commonwealth countries, many recalled their role as a link connecting nations across continents. In Great Britain itself, her death triggered a wave of sympathy that few personalities can evoke. Hundreds of thousands of people lined up in kilometer-long queues to pay their last respects to her in Westminster Hall. They waited for hours, sometimes overnight, to pass by her coffin, an impressive sign of how deeply anchored it was in the consciousness of the people. The state funeral on September 19, 2022, was one of the largest protocol events in recent history. Millions watched the ceremony live on television, and heads of state and dignitaries from all over the world traveled to London. The images of the procession, the coffin on the carriage, accompanied by her family, from Buckingham Palace across the streets of London to Westminster Abbey, became a global symbol of farewell. Elizabeth II received the respect she had earned over 7 decades of tireless service. Her death also marked the beginning of a new era, the reign of King Charles III. For Charles, it was the conclusion of one of the longest preparation periods in history. He had been heir to the throne for more than 70 years. Now he had to slip into the role that had shaped his mother for so long. Already in the first days after her death, he emphasized that he wanted to continue the duty to which she had dedicated her life. But it was clear, no one could replace Elizabeth II. He could only try to continue her legacy. The Queen's legacy is multi-layered. Politically, she was a neutral figure who never interfered in day-to-day politics, but nevertheless had an enormous impact. She has witnessed and silently accompanied countless historical events: the Cold War, decolonization, European integration, globalization, the digital revolution. She met more heads of state and government than any other person of her time, from Winston Churchill to Liz Truss, from Dwight D. Eisenhower to Joe Biden. But her greatest legacy was not in politics, but in symbolism. She embodied consistency in a world of constant change. Her life was proof of a sense of duty, discipline, and loyalty, values that had become rare in an increasingly fast-moving society. She had kept the famous promise she had made as a 21-year-old to dedicate her life, long or short, to service until her last breath. She also left her mark personally. Her family, as much as she was plagued by scandals and crises, remained a center of affection for her. She experienced her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. She saw the wedding of Prince William and Catherine, the birth of George, Charlotte, and Louis, the path of Harry and Meghan. She experienced joy and pain, setbacks and triumphs, and always remained the calm pole in the midst of all the turbulence. For many Britons, her death became a moment of self-reflection. Elizabeth II was more than queen. She was part of collective life.
People born in the 1950s knew no other monarch. It was the fixed point of a nation that had undergone countless changes in these 7 decades. With her death, many also became aware that a piece of security had been lost. Their legacy is also reflected in the continued existence of the monarchy itself. Despite all the crises, scandals, and doubts, the institution remained stable under her leadership. She managed to lead the crown from empire to modern constitutional monarchy, from a world of stagecoaches to the age of the internet. Without Elizabeth, the monarchy might have faltered, but with her, it remained relevant. So, her death ended not only a life, but an era. Elizabeth II was the face of the 20th century and the first decades of the 21st century. She embodied continuity, dignity, and a sense of duty. Her farewell was a global event because she was not only the queen of a country, but a figure who had become a symbol for billions of people around the world. Charles III marked the beginning of a new era, but the Elizabeth II era remains unforgotten. As a chapter in history marked by stability in the midst of change, and as an example of how a single person, without political power, can shape the world through attitude and consistency alone.